Thank you, David. Thank you to UBS Center. Thank you to University of Zurich. Thank you to Torsten for having enabled the panelists, I think, to stay within their 15 minutes by laying many of the important definitions and distinctions already on the table. So Torsten has given us a definition of populism as a political movement with anti-elite, nativist, and I would add authoritarian tendencies. He's observed that different populist parties and movements combine these elements in different ways. So you get left-wing populism, which emphasizes the anti-elite element, and right-wing populism, which emphasizes hostility toward foreigners and minorities. We've already heard about the contest between economic explanations and cultural explanations, and the question of whether that's a false dichotomy or not. I think I would nuance the two stories slightly differently. I would follow David and depart from the emphasis in Torsten's presentation on the economic explanations. I think in many contexts, including that of the United States, the economic explanation is all about insecurity, more than it is about stagnating living standards or feeling left behind or rising inequality. It's a fear about the future, either about your own prospective economic insecurity or those of your children. So there's a declining social mobility, a fear of declining social mobility aspect of the economic explanation as well. The culture and identity alternative, I would define this as the challenge to the majority from immigrants and racial, religious, ethnic minorities to the once dominant majority. So from that point of view, populism is a protest against the declining influence of the traditions of that once dominant group. It's a reaction against the challenge posed by immigrants and minorities to the people as a homogeneous entity. I think I would add feminists to the list of others that many populists react against as well, because again, feminism is perceived as a challenge to the once dominant group in society. I think the timing is a special problem, more of a problem in many contexts for the cultural explanation than the economic one. We know what the economic shocks that societies have experienced in the last decade and more have been. What exactly the cultural tensions have been, I think, are harder to define. Take my country, for example. Just saying that the United States has a history of racial division and a 20th century history of hostility toward immigrants, at least from places other than Western Europe, can't tell us why these themes resonate so powerfully at the moment in the US. Similarly, here I ask Matthew's forgiveness for turning to the Brexit issue. Simply observing that Britons have always been suspicious of Europe cannot explain why Brexit now resonates so much more powerfully than it did, say, in the first referendum on UK membership in the European Community back in 1975. So I too am tempted by the argument in Pippa Norris and Ronald Englehart's book, Cultural Backlash, to which Torsten referred. Their argument is that the swing in public opinion in both the US and the UK is generational. In the US, younger generations are richer, they're better educated, they're more secure on average than their parents. They embrace post-materialist values that emphasize secularism, personal autonomy, and diversity at the expense of traditional values of religiosity, traditional family structures and conformity. So this generational divide leaves the older generations feeling alienated. It renders them, in Norris and Inglehart's language, strangers in their own land. And those older voters disproportionately go to the polls, as we know. I would make a similar argument about Brexit. Today's young have grown up flying around Europe on Ryanair. They've grown up interacting with Italian baristas and French au pairs. They're more educated on average than their elders. They've had their education shaped by the EU's Bologna process. So they're more likely to identify as European. In contrast, their older, more Eurosceptical parents are left feeling strangers in their own land, or in this case, strangers in Europe. So they feel the opposite way. And consistent with that interpretation, 7 out of 10 young voters preferred to remain in the EU in 2016, while 2/3 of those over the age of 65 voted to leave. This narrative has powerful long-run implications. Over time, the older materialist, so-called materialist generation will die out. In the US, its members will become dominated by numerically by younger, better educated generations who value diversity rather than denigrating it. In the UK, they will become dominated numerically by younger, better educated generations who've flown around Europe on Ryanair, who value Europe rather than dismissing it. Strong predictions about the future have been based on this pattern. According to one study of the UK electorate by YouGov, with each passing day, the Remain majority shrinks by exactly 1,356 votes. An arithmetic that suggests that Remain moved into the lead last January 19th. This, of course, is wrong. YouGov assumes that opinions are durably and immutably molded when people are young. What this misses is that, in addition, there is an aging or seasoning effect. People grow more conservative and, in the UK case, Eurosceptical as they age. Psychological studies show that individuals, as they age, grow more closed-minded and less cognitively flexible. Introspection suggests to me that there is something to the point. In addition, as older people are likely to acquire property. They're more likely to live on fixed incomes, so they understandably become more risk-averse and more worried as they age about loss of control. This view suggests that as today's young continue to age, some will shift from supporting Remain to supporting Leave. In the limit, this aging effect can explain the entirety of what you see in public opinion polls, the observed age-leave gradient or relationship. And since longer lifetimes and low birth rates are causing the British electorate to grow older, the implications for public opinion are exactly the opposite of those that flow from the cohort-based interpretation. It turns out that, courtesy of the British electoral election study, we have responses to questions about UK membership in the EU going back to the 1970s. So this survey has been taken around the time of every general election in the UK and also around the time of the 2 EU membership referenda. This is big data it's not as big data as Torsten showed you, but it's a big data set by my standards of some 100,000 survey responses spread over a long period of time. So with the help of a couple of co-authors, I matched up the answers with information on each respondent's cohort, when they were born, and his or her age at the time surveyed. The problem with using these data to analyze the kind of question I posed, is it an aging effect or is it a cohort effect, is that other conditions also vary year to year, and therefore survey to survey. Put it another way, if I tell you when the survey was taken and the age of the respondent, you can immediately calculate when that individual was born. So for the technically inclined, this means that the age, the cohort, and the year in which the survey was taken effects are perfectly correlated with one another. So to make any headway on analyzing this question, you have to make further assumptions. One can solve this problem in a variety of different ways. Probably the simplest way is to substitute something like indicators of current economic conditions for the indicator of the year in which the survey was taken, to remove the year effect and substitute for it the level of unemployment, things like that, in the year in question, which moves in a nonlinear fashion with respect to year. When you do that, you immediately discover two things. Number one, the age and cohort effects are both there. They do work in opposite directions as predicted. As the earliest cohorts die off, anti-EU sentiment wanes, but as the UK population ages, that population grows more Eurosceptical, and the two effects roughly cancel one another out. What doesn't cancel out, and what in fact produces sharp swings in public opinion year to year, are those current economic conditions. So our estimates suggest, in fact, that relatively modest economic grievances tipped the balance in the UK referendum in 2016. In other words, slightly faster productivity growth, slightly less inequality, slightly greater economic security would have been enough to produce a different outcome. The overwhelming importance of economic conditions seems to have been true for the referendum, so I think we're back to where we started. Populism and Brexit are at least as much about economics as they are about culture and identity. David warned me when we were talking about this session that we would be charged with discussing cures, responses, as well as diagnosing the problem. I'll say 1 minute's worth of comments on that. I think the fact that populism and Brexit are at least as much about economics as they are about culture and identity is reassuring. If authoritarian, xenophobic populism is rooted in cultural identity concerns, then it's far from clear how to address it. If, on the other hand, it's rooted in economics, then we know a lot about how to address it, at least in principle, namely with policies that enhance socioeconomic mobility, that reduce income disparities, and importantly, that increase perceived economic security and help left-behind places. I argue in my book that we, in fact, know a lot about such policies, about the benefits of early childhood education, universal access to health care, place-based policies. We know a lot about the relevant responses, but the question is whether we possess the political and social cohesion needed to implement them. Thank you.